Hi, this is Rhonda Kuning back again with another file folder art journal page. I started out with just the idea of using texture and squares, and I had a whole bunch of strips of paper in a scrap box that I keep underneath my art table to collect leftover bits of paper from what I'm working on. So I decided to weave those into a little mat and add some squares that way, as well as adding bits of paper that I'd torn into rough squares, very rough squares. I don't do neat very well. I find it much easier to do messy, so that's what I do. I'm gluing those down with some Mod Podge, and that also I'm using to hold the pages of two files together while I'm working. I'll cut those apart at the end to separate them, because it's much easier to work on the individual files than to work on a whole bunch. Otherwise you might as well just work on a book. Now I've got some tape. It's adhesive mesh tape. In America they call it drywall tape. In Australia we call it plasterboard tape. You find it in your hardware shop, and as I said, it's square mesh tape, and it went with the theme, so I put it on the page. And these are some squares of scrapbooking paper that I had in my box. Well, I had the paper in there and I just cut them into squares, very rough squares, and I'm gluing those down again with the Mod Podge. And when it's dry, cut all the edges off, protect the previous pages with some baking paper, and that works most of the time. And to unify this all together, I'm using some diluted gesso. I diluted it because I still wanted to be able to see the pages underneath, although by the end of it you can't really see a great deal of it. Now the next part I missed because I didn't turn the camera on. And what I did was I mixed up some phthalo blue, some crimson, some gloss medium varnish and some water, put it on the page, and then wiped it off with a wet wipe after it was mostly dry. And now I'm spraying it with water and lifting off some more paint with some tissue and tissue paper, just to give it a real mottled effect and so that you can see the texture behind it. This is now completely dry, and I'm using my sepia pit pen. You don't want to use your pit pens on damp paint or wet paint because it wrecks them. And I'm just going again with the square theme and drawing lines out from the woven paper mat that I've made, and continuing to make a very rough X shape. Now this is burnt umber diluted with some gloss medium and varnish and some water. The burnt umber paint is supposed to be semi-opaque, but it is quite opaque if you use it straight. So I wanted to be able to see the texture underneath, so I diluted it down. And I'm just, as you can tell, filling in the alternate squares. And I'm using a square brush because it just makes it easier when you're drawing squares. And I should have started from one side and worked across because it would have been so much easier, but that's why I turned the page around. And I'm using the excess paint just to mark around that X shape so that it doesn't seem to be floating quite so much onto the page. Dilute it down with a bit more water, and using my fan brush to add some splatters. I like getting splatters with the fan brush because you end up with all different sizes. They're not all the same size. Now to do the alternate squares, I'm using some diluted white ink, and as you can see it's really runny. And I wanted to still be able to see the texture underneath. You could, if you want, use some diluted white paint or gesso. Just make sure you dilute it with lots and lots of water, otherwise you'll cover up the texture because white paint is quite opaque, even more opaque than burnt umber. And I'm just doing those alternate squares, and as I did before, I used the fan brush to add some splatters, but the splatters were really quite bright, so I got a dry wet wipe and pounced those up a bit, and then added some more until I was happy with the effect. You can see all the different sizes of splatters. I like that. Now again, wait until it's really dry before you use your pens on it, and I'm using a Sigma white pen, my Pitt pen, and some gesso to put the verse in, and the verse is Acts 2:28, and it says, "You make the path of life known to me, in your presence is complete joy." And of course I spell presents wrong, and I make a few mistakes in here, but hey. Perfection is not my goal, which is a good thing because there's no way I can do perfection. And I'm using the Sigma pen, the Pitt pen rather, to sign it because I think I'm finished. So this is what the texture looks like. But of course I'm not finished because it just looks too bland, and it's really just a verse on a page that's covered in paint. It doesn't speak to me. So I leave it overnight to figure out what I'm going to do with it. Do I just paint it over and start again or not? So I go with the joy part of the verse, and I got some flowers out of my scrapbooking stash, paper flowers, got some paint, sprayed them with some water and dipped them in some diluted paint, and that makes them suck up the paint, and they look really nice that way. And it also means that they meld in with the page without standing out like a sore thumb. And of course I forget how I've put them together once I've got them apart. I should have taken a photo while I had them the way I wanted them, but hey. And of course I've done all that on a silicone mat because it makes it so much easier. And there I am trying to figure out how I had them before. And they're not the same as when I had them before at the end, but that's alright. Now I use the phthalo blue paint as a glue, as well as the Dimensional Magic, which is wonderful stuff for gluing heavier items onto a page, and has the added bonus of being really glossy. So I'm using it as both a glue and for the glossy effect in the middle of the flowers. You could also put something in the centre of those flowers. The previous page I put some rhinestones in the centres, but I didn't want to have as much in this as I did there. And again, I think I'm finished because it actually looks like the page is illustrating the verse. But as I do with my work, I leave it overnight and come back to it the next day and see what I think. And it just looked bland. It's just blue and brown. So I got out the colour that is the contrasting colour for blue is orange, because it's on the opposite side of the colour wheel. So I'm using cadmium orange and highlighting the words that mean something to me in this verse, which is the path of life and joy. And put a little bit of the orange in the centre of the flowers, dilute a little bit and splatter it on the page, and then I'm happy. It actually looks more joyous to me as well. I mean, a blue page is hardly an illustration of joy, really, is it? So this is what I end up with. And this is not my best video, I know that. Hopefully next time will be better. There's a close-up of the texture, flowers, and the whole thing, well, most of it. See you next time.